There are only two possibilities. Either reality gives you too little to fix what something means, or language gives you too much. You live your life starved of signs from the outside and drowning in projections from your own. Either way, no final meaning, ever. This isn't philosophy. It's the structure of every conversation, every text, every market, every argument that never resolved. And it starts with the same question hidden inside the Tower of Babel story. One civilization has been failing to answer ever since.
Every time two people speak, one of them sets sail. Steiner said it in 1975, and nobody listened. No two human beings use words to mean the same thing, not even close. The sea between you and me has no name on any map. We each carry what Steiner called a private thesaurus, built from memory, from the body, from everything that ever happened to us before we opened our mouths. You speak, I receive. Something is always lost at sea, and here's the part that should disturb you. Language was never only for reaching each other. Steiner says, we speak to communicate, but also to conceal, to leave unspoken. Every sentence contains a sentence it decided not to say. Inside every conversation there is a second conversation, happening in silence. Steiner calls it duplicity. Not lying, just the gap between what moves through you and what actually leaves your mouth. You hear my words, you do not hear what sent them. Under enough pressure, the translation breaks. Steiner writes, under stress of hatred, of boredom, of sudden panic, great gaps open, and you hear each other for the first time, with sickening conviction that you share no common language. The shipwreck is when you finally understand the distance, and then silence. Not the absence of language. This is language at its most honest. We were always far apart. Now we know it, and still, we keep setting sail. Not because we will arrive, not because the other shore speaks our language, but because, Steiner says, any act of communication is already a translation, a transfer across distance. To speak is to believe the other shore exists.
A man sits alone at night. A candle burns low. The room is quiet. In front of him, a sacred text. Not just any text, one believed to carry something more than meaning, something closer to presence. He has been asked to translate it, to move it from one language into another. He lifts the pen and hesitates, because suddenly this doesn't feel like a task. It feels like a risk. Not the risk of making a mistake, the risk of doing something that should not be done. He begins anyway, Line by line, he rewrites the text into a new tongue, clearer, more accessible, easier to read. And yet, with each sentence, something slips. Not the content, the sentences still mean the same thing, but the force changes. What was once immediate now feels mediated. What was once spoken now feels reported, as if the words had taken a step away from themselves. George Steiner once suggested that the real question about translation is not whether it is possible, but whether it is, in some sense, forbidden. Because if language once carried something sacred, then translation is not neutral. It is a descent, a movement downward, one step further from the source. This is why ancient traditions were uneasy about it. St. Paul draws a line. There are forms of speech that should not be translated at all, not because they are unclear, but because they belong somewhere else, spoken to God, not to the public. To bring them into ordinary language is not clarification, it is exposure. In one early Jewish tradition, when the law was translated into Greek, darkness fell over the world for 3 days. Darkness. Not because the translators failed, but because they succeeded. Because something that should have remained intact had entered circulation. And this is where the problem of evil begins to shift. It is no longer only about suffering. It becomes a question about transmission. What happens when truth enters the world? What happens when something pure is forced to pass through language, interpretation, repetition? Does it survive? Or does it arrive already altered? Maybe evil is not only what destroys things. Maybe it is what happens when what is highest cannot appear without loss. When every attempt to say something true makes it slightly less true. If you've been following this channel, you already know where this is going. Meaning is not something that travels well. Not across languages, not across theories. Every attempt to explain what a set of signs means is never neutral. It always assumes a ground, a position from which meaning can be extracted, stabilized, made visible. But that ground is not innocent. It projects. A model of meaning does not simply reveal what is there, it adds to it. It reorganizes it. It enriches it, but in doing so, it also displaces it. The psychologist and the sociologist face the same dilemma. They approach a phenomenon trying to explain it, to decode it, to make sense of it, but in the process, they end up seeing themselves. Their categories, their assumptions, their frameworks begin to fill the space. What was supposed to be explained becomes surrounded by new layers of explanation, and now there is more to account for than before. This is the hidden risk of translation, not just between languages, but between frameworks. One begins by assuming loss, that something will not survive the passage, that the other cannot be fully captured, and so one compensates. One adds context, structure, interpretation. One inflates. More meaning is introduced in order to preserve meaning. long before sacred texts were protected, before translation became a discipline, before theory tried to explain it away. A man sits at a desk in Rome, Cicero, and he hesitates for the same reason, not because he doesn't know how to translate, but because he already suspects that carrying meaning across is never just innocent and neutral carrying. A man sits at a desk in Rome. It is 46 BC. Cicero is translating, not copying words, moving something from one language into another. And he hesitates, because already the problem is there. Do you translate word for word, or do you carry meaning across? He writes a line that will echo for 2,000 years. Not verbum pro verbo, not word for word. And from that moment on, something begins, not a technique, a struggle. St. Jerome will take it up, Luther will fight with it, poets, philosophers, translators, again and again, trying to answer the same question. What is it that survives translation? And the more they try to answer it, the more something becomes clear. It is not just words that fail to transfer. It is meaning itself that refuses to stay fixed. Translation is not just a technique, it is a case study, because for it to exist as a theory at all, it has to assume two things. First, that there is something there to be studied, something stable enough to survive transfer. Second, that this something is not exhausted by any single language, that it can, in some sense, move across them. In other words, translation presupposes depth. Not just the operational structure of language, not just syntax and use, but something that holds through them, something we call meaning. But this is where the tension begins, because the mechanics of a language can activate meaning without ever grounding it. A system can function, coordinate, even stabilize behavior, almost by accident. A creole can emerge under pressure, enabling trade, command, exchange, even in the most violent conditions. It works. But what exactly is being carried? We only begin to see the liabilities of that system, what it distorts, what it erases, what it cannot hold, when what is being transported is intentionally tied to a source that is supposed to exceed the language itself. When the aim is not just coordination, but fidelity. So if one can translate, one may think, he gains a kind of security. You are no longer confined to a single language, no longer trapped inside one system of expression. But that same movement dissolves something else. Disagreement no longer has a clear place to be settled. There is no final surface where competing interpretations can be measured and resolved. Translation would bring that kind of metaphysical reassurance. One feels grounded with something more deep than language, but cannot share that publicly. Let's remove the distance. Forget Latin and Greek. Take a single text, a single author, a single language. Shakespeare. Now the problem is no longer between languages, it's inside the text itself. In 1623, Shakespeare's Cymbeline entered print, but the speech you read today is not exactly the one Shakespeare wrote. A modern editor changes punctuation, spelling, line breaks, even corrupt readings. And suddenly the question is no longer just what posthumous means. The question is, when did interpretation begin? In the reader? In the editor? Or in the text itself? In 1611 or so, we assume Shakespeare wrote the speech. In 1623, the first folio printed it. In 20th century, ardent editor silently reshapes it. And now you, as a modern reader, confronts not a text, but layers of historical decisions. Why does this feel sinister? Let's get back to the assumptions we hold about reading. We read the text as if it speaks through an author, as if behind the words there were a stable intention, something we could recover, almost see, as if it lived there quietly, waiting. And this illusion is not arbitrary. We need it. We assume intention must be coherent, faithful, structured, a kind of inner grammar behind the speech, a hidden architecture that makes the words make sense. And from that, we reverse engineer the author. But does this reconstruction have limits? And if it does, where are they? In After Babel, George Steiner raises this question in a disturbing way. While analyzing a single passage from Cymbeline, Posthumus's monologue in Act 2, he asks, how far does a complete reading of a text really go? Which contexts are relevant? Which can we legitimately ignore? And the answer he offers is uncomfortable. No text prior to or contemporary with Shakespeare can, a priori, be dismissed as irrelevant. No aspect of Elizabethan or European culture is formally without bearing. The text doesn't come with its own instructions for how wide to cast the net. There's no internal mechanism that says, stop here, this context is enough. So when we do make that selection, and we always do, that act of selection is not a philological decision. It's a theoretical one, or even a political one. It reveals assumptions we project, and with that, we are not reverse engineering Shakespeare, but remaking Shakespeare. We are not decoding meaning, we are making more meaning. And if this is the structure we are dealing with, where do we actually see it? We see it everywhere. We see it in how nonsense keeps returning to cycles of sense, in how pure noise refuses to remain noise. We see it in markets where randomness becomes trend and trend becomes belief, because the vacuum of sense cannot be sustained. It forces an abdication of neutrality. And then the question is no longer, are you being rigorous or subjective? It's which metaphysics are you smuggling in, and are you aware of it? Even now, one assumption remains untouched. That behind all of this, behind the text, behind the variations, behind the interpretations, there is still a stable source, a mind, an origin. Something that thinks before it is written, something that could, in principle, mean clearly. So let's move one step closer, not the text, not the editor, but the thinker. Because if meaning were ever stable, this is where it would have to be. And if it fails here, it doesn't fail somewhere. It fails everywhere. What language do you dream in? There's a question that neurolinguists rarely ask, and that poets ask all the time. When you are in your deepest thought, not speaking to anyone, not writing, not performing, in what language do you exist? For someone who grew up inside a single language, the question seems strange, too obvious to be interesting. But for someone who grew up between 2, 3 languages, the question is unsettling, because the answer isn't simple. Sometimes it's one language, sometimes it's another. Sometimes it's a space that doesn't fully belong to either. Steiner calls this unhousedness, a condition of linguistic non-belonging. Not exactly a lack, perhaps a condition of a different kind of perception. Because when you don't fully belong to a language, you start to notice something strange. Thought no longer feels like expression. It doesn't feel like something coming out of a stable center. It feels more like a process of resolution. As if each thought begins already displaced, already shaped by multiple overlapping systems that don't fully align. And when it moves from one language to another, what carries over is not the content, not the words, not even the exact idea. What carries over is something more elusive, a set of constraints, a pressure for the thought to continue in a certain way. Like when a fragment of one language refuses to disappear inside another, not by being translated, but by bending the sentence from within. A rhythm that doesn't belong, a structure that slightly misfits, a way of connecting ideas that comes from somewhere else, not visible as content, but active in how the thought unfolds. Now here is where philosophy steps in. Willard van Orman Quine looks at this and says, the problem is not excess, it's lack. The world never gives you enough to fix what something means. The same evidence can support multiple incompatible interpretations. Meaning is underdetermined. But then Jacques Derrida turns the problem around. He says, no. The problem is not that there is too little, it's that there is too much. From a single structure, you can extract multiple coherent patterns, multiple meanings that all work. So now the instability you felt inside thought is no longer a psychological issue. It is trapped between two pressures. Not enough to decide, too much to control. And either way, no final meaning.
Bad translations don't fail because they say too little. They fail because they say too much. Walter Benjamin, in The Task of the Translator, gives a strange image. Even if something is forgotten by everyone, it may still demand to be remembered. as if preserved in the memory of God. Translation, then, is not just about transferring meaning. It's about touching something that exceeds us. According to Willard Van Orman Quine, the world never gives you enough to fix meaning. The same evidence can support multiple, incompatible interpretations. Nothing forces a final reading. But according to Jacques Derrida, the problem is not scarcity, it's excess. Take a single structure, say a sequence, a pattern, a form. From it, you can extract a rule, a trend, a hidden intention, a law, a coincidence, a signal, a narrative. The same configuration can sustain multiple coherent patterns at once. So, if reality doesn't fix meaning, underdetermination, and structure generates too many candidates, overdetermination, then you get instability driven by excess, not absence. Now look at how this plays out in the real world. The market doesn't wait for certainty. It treats every fluctuation as a potential pattern, a trend, a signal, a continuation. It has to, because action cannot wait for truth. So it projects structure onto noise and corrects itself later, sometimes too late. The law does something similar. A precedent doesn't just apply, it rewrites what came before. Each decision reads past decisions through its own frame, expanding, narrowing, distorting. Over time, the system becomes a layered interpretation of itself, not a stable foundation, but a history of re-significations. In one direction, this leads back to translation. What looks like a simple transfer between languages turns into a site of proliferation. There is no single meaning to preserve, only a field of competing possibilities to stabilize. Every translation is already a decision, a cut through excess, and that cut is never neutral. In another direction, it leads to culture itself. Resignification becomes a force. Symbols are rewritten, histories reinterpreted, identities reframed. Not because meaning is missing, but because there is too much of it to control.
Interpretation does not resolve, it accumulates. And we live inside that accumulation, not just in language, in systems that have to act before meaning is settled. Markets move on patterns that may not be there. Law builds decisions on interpretations that rewrite what came before. One interpretation is taken forward, and others are left behind. And once that choice begins to accumulate, it looks like necessity, like tradition, like history itself.
There is a strange idea that a culture can be missing a book it never wrote. Not lost, not destroyed, but absent in the way something essential fails to happen. At the beginning of the 20th century, a man became obsessed with this absence, Rudolf Borchardt. He asked a question that sounds almost absurd at first. Why is there no German Divine Comedy? Not a translation, not an imitation, but something that should have emerged from the language itself. Because everything seemed aligned. Medieval Germany stood at a crossroads, between the northern myths and the Mediterranean order, between pagan remnants and Latin Christianity, between fragmentation and form. And yet, no Dante. Dante Alighieri appears in Italy and reshapes an entire language. But in German, nothing comparable happens. For Borchardt, this was not an accident. It was a fracture, a missed convergence between language, world, and form. Something that should have crystallized never did. And the consequences, he believed, were irreversible. Even Martin Luther, who gave German its modern voice, did not resolve this absence. His language, powerful as it was, struggled with something deeper. The weight of the original, the density of meaning, the sensuous force of sacred text. It organized, it clarified, but it did not incarnate. And so German became something else, more structured, more administrative, more distant from the fusion of thought and image that Dante had achieved. But Borchardt refused to accept this as final. Because he believed something dangerous, that the past is not fixed, that history is not a closed record, but a field that can be rewritten from the present. Translation for him was not fidelity, it was intervention, an act of force. What is interesting here is how meaning is supposed to settle, and translation seems to disrupt. Of course, the translator is a theorist like any other. He cannot presuppose the absence of meaning when projecting extensions of pieces of the language he studies. He must act as if something is settled. But then one might say, this is useless. He sees meaning not because it is there, but because he projects it. Because in the end, he projects something of his own. And the result is already part of the very foreign imposition he is trying to overcome.
George Steiner once told a story about translators that sounds like it is about language, but is actually about something much stranger. He said, "The best translators are not the ones who know the foreign language best. They are the ones who feel at home in it, who arrive at a text and have the uncanny sense of having been there before they came, a recognition, almost a memory of something they never lived." He is now, Steiner says, the man who needs the translation least. He can hear the original. He lives inside it. The translation becomes, at that moment, almost superfluous to him personally. So why does he go on? Because bringing it home, recrossing the divide, carrying the meaning back, is the only moment he feels the original is truly his. The translation is not for the reader. It is the act by which the translator takes possession of something that was never quite his to begin with. Which means every translation is, in some sense, a beautiful act of theft disguised as generosity. And that is exactly the structure of what happens when we try to formalize meaning. We enter it, we feel at home, we believe we have captured it, and then we realize what we brought back is not quite the original. Something was lost in the crossing, or changed, or quietly replaced by our own pulse, mistaken for the beat of the alien sea. As with a seashell, the translator can listen strenuously, but mistake the rumour of his own pulse for the beat of the alien sea. George Steiner, After Babel, page 379. The passage comes from George Steiner, After Babel, Aspects of Language and Translation, Oxford University Press, first published 1975. The specific section is the hermeneutic motion, which in the third edition, 1998, appears on pages 378 to 380, the edition most commonly referenced in academic work.